On a Tuesday morning in August 1981, federal agents pulled up to the offices of the Little Havana Activities and Nutrition Center, a municipal charity responsible for feeding thousands of elderly Cuban refugees across Dade County. They were there for the director. Rafael Villaverde was 39 years old. He wore tailored suits and shook hands with senators. He had survived the Bay of Pigs invasion, endured a communist prison, and returned to Miami as one of the most respected figures in the exile community. Congressman Claude Pepper knew him by name. Mayor Maurice Ferre treated him as a political ally. The elderly of Little Havana considered him their protector. The agents placed him in handcuffs alongside 51 co-defendants in an operation the authorities had codenamed TikToks. The charges described something other than civic leadership. They described a man who had spent the previous decade coordinating multi-ton cocaine shipments from South America, brokering weapons deals with foreign guerrillas, and managing an international logistics network so sophisticated it rivaled the intelligence operations he had once conducted on behalf of the United States government. Standing before Dade County Circuit Judge Gerald Cogan, Villaverde offered a single piece of mitigating context. He claimed he had spent 17 years in a Cuban political prison. The statement was designed to recast the moment, to transform an arraignment into an injustice committed against a long-suffering patriot. The intelligence archives tell a different story. His imprisonment lasted months, not decades, and the years he claimed to have spent rotting in a dungeon were actually spent in Laos, Cambodia, and across Latin America, running covert operations for the Central Intelligence Agency. He had been lying about who he was for so long that the lie had become load-bearing architecture. And the morning the handcuffs clicked shut, the entire structure started to groan. Rafael Villaverde was born on March 8, 1942, in Cuba, the son of a Catholic priest. He grew up alongside his brothers, Jorge and Raul, in a household defined by religious conviction and fierce anti-communism, two belief systems that, in the Cuba of the late 1950s, placed the family directly in the crosshairs of Fidel Castro's revolution. When the regime consolidated power, the Villaverdes fled to Florida. They arrived with nothing but displacement and rage, and they found a government eager to harness both. The Central Intelligence Agency was building a paramilitary strike force from exactly this kind of raw material. Young, motivated exiles who had lost everything and wanted it back. Villaverde enlisted in Brigade 2506. He did not receive standard military instruction. The agency trained him in demolitions, maritime infiltration, covert radio operations, and guerrilla warfare tactics designed for operating behind hostile lines. They taught him how to move through a country without leaving a trace, how to build networks that could withstand interrogation, and how to view the world as an operational problem with operational solutions. He was 19 years old, and he was already learning to think like a man with no legal boundaries. In April 1961, Brigade 2506 launched the Bay of Pigs invasion. The operation was supposed to trigger a popular uprising against Castro. Instead, it collapsed on the beach. The air support never came. The naval backup never materialized. The brigade fought until they had nothing left to fire, and then they were captured by the very forces they had come to overthrow. The United States government, which had trained them, armed them, and dropped them on that coastline, watched from a safe distance as the mission disintegrated. Villaverde was taken prisoner and transported to the Castillo del Príncipe, a colonial-era fortress converted into a detention facility. The conditions were designed not to hold men, but to hollow them out. The cells were infested with rats and fungus. The prisoners slept on stone floors, drank contaminated water, and ate gruel that arrived with insects already in it. Medical attention did not exist. When tobacco ran out, they smoked dried orange peels. Some of them did not survive. Villaverde did. And the man who walked out of that prison was fundamentally different from the one who walked in. In December 1962, the United States negotiated the release of 1,113 surviving prisoners in exchange for $53 million in food and medical supplies. Days later, President Kennedy addressed the returning brigade at a rally in Palm Beach. Villaverde stood among them, a 20-year-old who had been promised air cover by the most powerful nation on earth and received silence instead. The public saw a young patriot, scarred but unbroken. The reality was more dangerous than that. What Villaverde carried out of Castillo del Príncipe was not a renewed commitment to democratic ideals. It was a conviction, hardened into permanent psychological infrastructure, that institutions exist to be used, and that loyalty to any authority other than yourself is a fatal weakness. The government that trained him had abandoned him to die in a foreign dungeon. He would never make the mistake of trusting an institution again. He would only make the mistake of becoming one. Upon his return to Florida, Villaverde was immediately absorbed into Operation 40, a classified CIA unit whose mandate went far beyond conventional intelligence gathering. Operation 40 was an assassination and sabotage program targeting foreign political figures deemed hostile to American interests. Its roster included some of the most dangerous men the exile community ever produced, operatives who would later surface in events ranging from political assassinations to the Watergate break-in. These were not analysts. They were operators trained to destabilize governments, eliminate targets, and leave no documentation behind. Villaverde thrived in this environment. The moral framework he had carried out of Cuba, the belief that the fight against communism justified any action, was reinforced daily by handlers who never asked him to consider the ethical dimensions of his assignments. Violence was not a failure of diplomacy. It was a sanctioned tool with a budget line. And every successful operation deepened his conviction that the rules governing ordinary citizens simply did not apply to men like him. By 1966, his capabilities drew the attention of Ted Shackley, one of the CIA's most aggressive Cold War managers. Shackley was overseeing the secret war in Laos and needed operatives who could function in lawless, deeply hostile territory without institutional oversight. He selected Villaverde for what intelligence historians would later call the secret team, a group deployed to Southeast Asia with a mandate that blurred the line between counterinsurgency and organized crime so thoroughly that the line ceased to exist. In the Golden Triangle, Villaverde received his real education. The CIA's strategy in Laos depended on local warlords, particularly General Vang Pao, to fight the communist Pathet Lao. Funding these proxy forces required capital that could not appear on any congressional budget. The solution was the opium trade. Villaverde and the secret team operated at the center of the machinery, neutralizing Vang Pao's regional competitors, consolidating narcotics production under allied warlords, and moving product across international borders through front companies like the Zhengkuang Air Transport Company. For Villaverde, it was a masterclass delivered by the same government that had already taught him everything else. The mechanics were elegant and transferable. Move weapons south into a conflict zone, move narcotics north out of it, use proprietary air transport to bypass customs, launder the proceeds through shell companies in jurisdictions that ask no questions, ensure that the intelligence apparatus provides top cover, shielding the entire operation from law enforcement scrutiny so long as the broader geopolitical objectives are met. Villaverde watched this system function at industrial scale. He internalized its architecture completely, and when the geopolitical objectives eventually shifted and the funding dried up, he did not forget what he had learned. He simply filed it away, waiting for the moment when the infrastructure could be repurposed. Throughout the remainder of the 1960s and into the 1970s, Villaverde operated across Vietnam, Cambodia, and Latin America as a high-level contract asset. Former associates and federal investigators would later characterize him as an operative who handled problems overseas using major corporations as cover for his movements. He accumulated a vast network of international contacts: arms dealers, maritime smugglers, corrupt bankers, intelligence officers from half a dozen countries, and a skill set that no civilian career could possibly absorb. By the time the proxy wars of the Cold War began to wind down, Rafael Villaverde was a man with the operational capacity to run a small government. What he needed was a base of operations, and what he built was something far more clever than a front company. In 1972, Villaverde founded the Little Havana Activities and Nutrition Center with a modest $50,000 grant from the United Fund. The stated mission was simple and virtuous: feed the elderly Cuban refugees who had lost everything in the revolution and now found themselves aging in a foreign country with no safety net. The timing was deliberate. The anti-Castro paramilitary funding was drying up, and the exile community was transitioning from a temporary refugee population into a permanent political constituency. Villaverde recognized something his peers did not: that the thousands of aging exiles scattered across Dade County represented an untapped reserve of political leverage. Control their meals, their transportation, their daily social infrastructure, and you controlled their votes. Control their votes, and you controlled the politicians. The center expanded rapidly. It grew from a single cafeteria on Calle Ocho into a sprawling network of facilities serving thousands of meals daily, managing health programs, and operating fleets of buses across the county. Villaverde positioned himself at its center, leveraging his verified status as a Bay of Pigs survivor and political prisoner to secure millions in state and federal grants. To investigate him was to attack the elderly of Little Havana. He had built the most effective shield in Miami. What made the operation genuinely brilliant was that it was not merely a front. The center actually provided services. Elderly refugees actually received meals. The charity actually functioned. This was not a hollow shell company with a mailbox address. It was a fully operational municipal institution with real employees, real clients, and real political patrons. The legitimacy was structural, not cosmetic, but the internal economics told a different story. Top administrators drew salaries exceeding $130,000 and drove leased BMWs paid for with public funds. The drivers who actually transported the seniors earned roughly $12,000 a year, often falling below minimum wage. The quality of the food served to the elderly deteriorated steadily. Seniors submitted formal, signed complaints about meals so unidentifiable that residents gave one recurring dish the nickname Fantasy Five. Critics within the community quietly called the center's leadership Chupa Viejos, those who feed off the old. The surplus capital was quietly absorbed by the administration, and the political machine hummed along without interruption. When a politician needed to demonstrate grassroots support, Villaverde deployed his bus fleets to transport hundreds of seniors to rallies and polling stations. When a candidate needed a public endorsement from the exile community, they visited the cafeteria on Calle Ocho and posed for photographs with the director. He became known as the weather vane of anti-Castro activities, the man whose backing signaled which way the political winds were blowing. The logistical framework he had built, fleet management, complex supply chains, untraceable cash flows, administrative compartmentalization, political access, was functionally identical to the framework required to manage a transnational smuggling operation. He had learned this lesson years earlier, when the CIA placed him in a job with the United Fund, specifically to study how charities and social services operated. He had taken the training and inverted it. The skills designed to build institutions of public good were now the architectural blueprint for an empire of private wealth. The Mutiny Hotel in Coconut Grove was the undisputed nerve center of Miami's underworld, the kind of place where federal prosecutors drank scotch at one table while cartel enforcers ordered champagne at the next. Villaverde operated from its VIP booths, and from there, he assembled an operation of staggering scope. Working alongside his brothers under the alias Gris Brothers, he built a cocaine distribution network supplied directly by Colonel Luis Arce Gomez, the interior minister of Bolivia's military dictatorship. The logistics favored cargo vessels over speedboats, slower, less glamorous, but exponentially harder to intercept. It was a preference that revealed his operational DNA. He did not think like a drug dealer. He thought like an intelligence officer managing a supply chain through hostile territory. Patience over flash. Discipline over spectacle. Federal court records and intelligence dossiers later placed the Gris Brothers network in direct coordination with the Colombian cartels at their apex, serving as critical logistical partners for the organizations of Pablo Escobar and Jorge Ochoa. At its height, the pipeline was implicated in managing the logistics for a substantial portion of the cocaine entering the United States. The scale alone would have been enough to define his legacy, but it was the ideological contradictions that revealed the full extent of his transformation. In September 1976, he accepted a meeting in Geneva with Edwin P. Wilson, a rogue CIA agent who had gone into business as an independent arms dealer for Muammar Gaddafi's Libyan government. Wilson, working through former intelligence contact Rafael Quintero, recruited the Villaverde brothers for a contract worth $1 million. The target, presented under cover of a deniable government operation, turned out to be a Libyan dissident, meaning the client was Gaddafi himself. Villaverde ultimately declined the contract and reported Wilson to United States authorities, a decision that contributed to the federal investigation dismantling Wilson's operation. On the surface, it looked like the act of a loyal patriot. In practice, it was a masterclass in misdirection. By handing the authorities a rogue agent on a silver platter, Villaverde reinforced his own image as a cooperative former asset and bought himself years of operational space while investigators focused elsewhere. The deepest contradiction, however, came through his dealings with Colombia's M19 guerrillas. The M19 was a Marxist insurgent movement, the precise ideological force Villaverde had been trained, imprisoned, and tortured to oppose. They possessed vast quantities of cocaine but lacked the international connections to procure military hardware. Villaverde provided the bridge. The money moved through the World Finance Corporation, a corrupt banking operation run by Guillermo Hernandez Cartaya, himself a Bay of Pigs veteran. Through Cartaya's network, Villaverde facilitated arms-for-drugs exchanges that placed advanced weaponry in the hands of the M19 in exchange for multi-ton narcotics shipments. A man who had suffered starvation in a communist prison was now deliberately arming communists. They had product. He had logistics. Nothing else entered the calculation. He still ran the community center. He still shook hands with mayors. He still fed the elderly on Calle Ocho. He had been living divided since the agency first taught him how at 19 years old. It was the only mode of existence he had ever known. The architecture of his empire was theoretically flawless, politically insulated, financially self-sustaining, operationally disciplined. It had one vulnerability. It required human participants. And the man who would ultimately detonate the entire structure was someone Villaverde had shared drinks with at the Mutiny for years. Ricardo "Monkey" Morales shared nearly every line on Villaverde's resume. Cuban exile, Bay of Pigs veteran, Operation 40 alumnus, CIA contract agent. But where Villaverde built systems designed to last, Morales burned through every system he touched, and every person inside it. He had worked simultaneously for the CIA, the FBI, the DEA, and Venezuelan intelligence. He had publicly claimed involvement in the bombing of a civilian airliner that took the lives of all 73 people aboard. He once described an act of extreme violence to a defense attorney with the emotional register of someone recounting a parking maneuver. Morales survived by a single, ruthlessly applied principle: always be more valuable to law enforcement as an informant than as a defendant. He navigated the criminal justice system not by evading it, but by continuously feeding it targets of higher value than himself. For years, Villaverde and Morales had coexisted in the rarefied atmosphere of Miami's intelligence criminal overlap, two apex predators sharing the same territory through mutual deterrence. The tension occasionally broke the surface. During one evening at the Mutiny Bar in the summer of 1980, a heated argument escalated until Morales began throwing pats of butter at Villaverde across the table. It was absurd. It was also a signal. In a world governed entirely by reputation, public humiliation was an act of war. The definitive rupture, though, had nothing to do with narcotics or territory. In late October 1980, an exclusive gathering was held to celebrate the birthday of a local customs agent. Villaverde's circle attended. Morales was not invited. For a man whose entire identity depended on his status as an ultimate insider, the exclusion was intolerable. It triggered something cold and final in a man who was already operating without moral boundaries. Morales recognized an opportunity to settle a personal grievance and secure absolute legal immunity in a single stroke. He approached the state prosecutors, sat down with Assistant State Attorney Rena Cohan, and laid out the complete architecture of the Grizz brothers' empire: supply lines, distribution networks, financial laundering systems, and the names of every principal involved. Villaverde's training in counter-surveillance had kept him invisible for 2 decades, but the threat he failed to anticipate was not a wiretap or a stakeout. It was a man from his own world, with his own training, who knew exactly where to aim. Armed with Morales' intelligence, investigators planted a listening device inside a ticking wall clock in the home of one of Villaverde's closest associates. The microphone captured weeks of unguarded conversation, logistics, shipment volumes, financial arrangements, recorded in meticulous detail while the clock ticked loudly enough to mask the electronic hum. The authorities named the investigation accordingly: Villaverde suspected nothing. He continued to operate the community center by day and manage the syndicate by night, entirely unaware that his conversations were being transcribed in a government office across town, and that the man who had handed over the keys was someone he had once considered a peer. In early August 1981, the coordinated sweep landed. 53 arrest warrants were executed across South Florida. Rafael, Jorge, and Raul Villaverde were among the first taken into custody. The spectacle of the arrest shattered the public illusion entirely. The man who had been photographed beside senators, who had commanded the political loyalty of Little Havana's elderly population, was now being described in court filings as the architect of a massive narcotics conspiracy. He posted bond, a surprisingly modest $10,000 that reflected the complex politics of prosecuting former intelligence assets, and returned immediately to the community center. Standing before a crowd of fiercely loyal seniors who viewed the arrest as a political persecution, he maintained absolute composure. He stepped down as executive director, handing the operation to his assistant Josefina Carbonell, ensuring the political machine would survive his absence. Behind the defiance, his position was catastrophic. The wiretaps provided the prosecution with thousands of hours of audio. Simultaneously, federal investigators pursuing the Edwin Wilson case were preparing to subpoena Villaverde regarding the Geneva meeting and the Libyan assassination contract. He was caught between two collapsing walls, a narcotics trial that threatened decades in prison, and an espionage investigation that threatened to expose the deepest operations of the Cold War underworld. The ecosystem around the Wilson investigation was becoming lethally toxic. Waldo Duberstein, a senior intelligence analyst connected to the network, was found dead of a shotgun wound in what was ruled a suicide. Kevin Mulcahy, the former CIA operative who had originally exposed Wilson's Libyan operations, was discovered dead outside a rural motel. The medical examiner cited natural causes. The timing invited other conclusions. Villaverde understood what was happening. Witnesses connected to this world were becoming liabilities, and liabilities were being resolved with finality. He could go to trial and face the wiretaps. He could cooperate and face the people the cooperation would expose. Or he could use the skills that had defined his entire adult life, the ability to disappear, to exit a hostile environment without leaving a trace, to solve an impossible problem by erasing the board entirely. He made his decision with the same clinical efficiency he had applied to every operational calculation since the age of 19. On March 31, 1982, Rafael Villaverde boarded a 36-foot cabin cruiser called the Michelle for a fishing trip near the Berry Islands in the Bahamas. He was out on bond, his trial looming, the Wilson subpoenas closing in. At approximately 5 in the morning, according to his companions, the vessel suffered a catastrophic explosion. His defense attorney later relayed the official account to the press. A stove malfunction had set Villaverde on fire, and he had jumped into the water. The Coast Guard searched for 2 days. They found wreckage. They found a single life jacket floating in open water. They did not find a body. The medical examiner ruled no foul play. The Bahamian authorities classified it as a maritime accident. Rafael Villaverde was declared legally dead. In the intelligence community and the Miami underworld, that verdict was met with something between skepticism and quiet admiration. Two theories competed for dominance, and decades later, neither has been conclusively resolved. The first holds that Villaverde was eliminated. He possessed operational knowledge spanning the CYA's proxy wars, the Colombian cartel's distribution architecture, Edwin Wilson's Libyan arms deals, and the M19 weapons exchanges. With federal prosecutors applying pressure from multiple directions, the risk that he would trade that knowledge for immunity was a calculation someone else made before he could. In this version, the man who had spent his career ensuring problems went away quietly became the problem that went away. The second theory, more widely held among those who understood his capabilities, suggests that the explosion was his final operation. Villaverde was a trained demolitions expert, a logistics specialist, and a man who had spent 20 years learning to cross borders without leaving a trace. He had access to offshore capital, false documentation, and the kind of international contacts that could facilitate a permanent disappearance. He had already lost his youth to one cage. The prospect of spending his remaining years inside another, this time an American one, was not something a man with his training and his resources was going to accept. In this version, he did what he was trained to do. He staged the blast, destroyed the evidence, and vanished into the network he had spent decades building. The circumstantial evidence supporting his survival is impossible to dismiss. During the Iran-Contra investigations of the mid-1980s, federal court documents and civil affidavits specifically identified the Grizz brothers, the operational alias used by Rafael and Raul Villaverde, as active participants in the clandestine resupply of the Nicaraguan Contras. Witnesses placed operatives matching their profile in Miami in 1984, 2 years after the explosion, allegedly brokering an assassination contract and coordinating with a Chilean right-wing operative named Amit Galil for the LHANC bombing. Intelligence sources reported a figure matching Villaverde's operational profile deployed to Iran and Libya during the height of the Arms for Hostages scandal. If Rafael Villaverde died in the Gulf that morning, he left behind an organization that continued to operate with remarkable precision under his name. If he survived, he simply returned to the only life he had ever known, moving under aliases, crossing borders without documentation, existing in the gaps between jurisdictions where no warrant could reach him. The final irony arrived 6 months after the explosion. A judge reviewing the Operation TikTok's case determined that the wiretap concealed in the wall clock had been authorized improperly. The audio evidence was suppressed. The conspiracy case collapsed. The charges were dismissed. Had he simply waited, he would have walked free. The men who orbited his world met ends that matched the world they inhabited. Ricardo Morales, the informant whose bruised ego triggered the entire collapse, was shot in a Key Biscayne bar 9 months after Villaverde vanished. Edwin Wilson received decades in federal prison. Years later, Jorge Villaverde was killed outside his Miami compound. He had not died of natural causes. Rafael Villaverde is not the story of a good man who became corrupt. He is the story of what happens when a government teaches a 19-year-old that rules are obstacles, that deception is a professional skill, and that the mission justifies any method, and then withdraws the mission while leaving the methods fully intact. He carried the survival instincts of Castillo del Príncipe into every room he entered for the rest of his life. Those instincts built the community center. They built the political machine. They built the smuggling network. They armed Marxist guerrillas in the name of a man who had once been tortured by Marxists. The instincts never changed. Only the targets did. Whether he is at the bottom of the Bahamian Sea or whether he walked away clean, the outcome reveals the same truth. A man who spends his entire adult life building systems designed to operate without accountability will eventually become indistinguishable from the systems he built. And when the moment comes to disappear, he will be better at it than anyone trying to find him. What do you think happened on that boat? Was he eliminated by the people he knew too much about? Or did he light the fuse himself and walk away? Let me know in the comments and subscribe for more.